a presentation and some slides. Clusters tend to be different, but they can be more or less extended. They can involve one or more sectoral specializations. But the key issue is that there are linkages, there is a collaboration, and the benefits of linkages and collaborations can be strengthened and can provide benefits to the firms in the cluster. So what I'm hinting is that we need to have a given degree of flexibility in defining what clusters are. Clusters can involve several firms or a few firms with one larger firm coordinating the activities of the others, or all firms identical, or all firms national, and in other cases some foreign, some local, and so on. But the key issue, and I want to get into this debate that tends to be very academic and not very useful in my mind, is that the key issues is that clusters tend to be agglomeration of firms where linkages and joint actions are possible and can be pursued. No one size fits all. Clusters, this is a diagram that UNIDO produced a few years ago, and where we had local clusters, the small scale manufacturers that sell locally, that sell to a large firm that has its subsidiary in the country, or that sell to buyers, export agents, and through them they get access to international markets. And in some cases, access to international markets is granted through the relationship with large-scale firms and manufacturers. So the idea of this diagram was to signal that small producers on their own find it very hard to get access to international markets, and that clusters are instrumental to get this access, as well as linkages with buyers and larger firms. That is, translated in our more modern words, value chains. So, linking up to foreign global markets beyond the national boundary would help firms to get access to these markets. And this is only one side of the coin. We're not talking about market access. We're talking about, through market access, we're talking about knowledge acquisition. Knowledge flows. Getting access to practices, to instruments, to recipes, to ideas that help the innovation learning process in firms.
I get the value of clusters and the role that it plays in terms of firms coming together and enjoying, all the benefits from that. But can you cite maybe any cases where you're in an environment where it's obvious that a cluster exists in terms of there is that kind of number of firms operating, but there is the absence of trust and the resistance to actually agglomerating and working together? And in terms of if you have any advice in terms of what mechanism to be used in order to deal with that? Well, there's so many of them to talk about.
This case is often observed. Yeah, this case is often observed, of course. And again, the idea that there's no one recipe that works everywhere. The firms are the center of this process, so they need to find themselves their advantages and the benefits of joint actions. That doesn't necessarily mean being friends and collaborating in all possible ways, but finding what we do with the IDB and our friends here at the table, or from the Compete Caribbean. It's one of the programs of the IDB promoting private sector development in the Caribbean. What we try to do is to typically our programs. And we would need another hour, perhaps more, to explain what we're aiming at. But the key idea is that first, we try to help firms to develop their own strategy, their own business plan, the business plan or the strategy of the cluster. that implies having an idea where these firms want to go, what the vision is, what the strategy is, what their bottlenecks, their current obstacles, and how to solve these bottlenecks in order to achieve the target that they are setting for themselves. And this is a process that needs to be very specific. We don't know whether in that case a laboratory or a visit to a foreign market or a new training program or inviting Walmart to collaborate with the cluster or something else is the right answer. But the effort is to bring to the table the different actors, collectively work and trying to visualize what the current obstacles are and try to find answers. And help firms, what the DEIP usually does, help firms to single out the most important, the most binding constraint that involves a collective action by the firms and trying to devote resources. That can be the resources from the bank or usually resources from the firms themselves. One of the ideas of our cluster programs is that we don't give away, we don't grant funding, we don't grant 100% funding. We usually work on a matching grant where each firm contributes to some extent, and this somehow signals the commitment and the relevance of the initiative. So it's not a magic recipe, but it's really helping different actors to work together and define what the best alternative is and what the way forward is. Let me add one simple idea. The work that Danny Roderick has been doing with several colleagues from Harvard, including Hausman and others, that Eddie was mentioning before, talking about these search processes and this modern industrial policy is, in a way, an effort to use this evidence at the local level of different firms and different actors joining efforts and each eliciting information from the others, whereby the business sector does know more than the government sector in some respect, and the government knows more in other respects, and there's the research and innovation and universities that also provide their efforts. So really working together and finding answers and defining, making a diagnosis first, and then setting out a vision and a strategy is fundamental, and is fundamental at the local level as well as the national level. Question?
I just actually wanted to add to the discussion, because we do work directly with clusters or an agglomeration of firms and organizations, and I think Indira's intervention is spot on, certainly for the region, in the sense that perhaps in the design of our program there was an assumption that the firms would be able to identify their issues and identify areas for collaboration, and were mature enough to understand that you can collaborate and compete at the same time. And we're actually, it's all empirical, but at this point, we're able to tell you unequivocally that the firms that we're working with cannot do that. But it doesn't mean that they don't have the potential to be exceptional, efficient clusters. It simply means that they need assistance in getting to that point. And I think that as far as the program is concerned, there's certainly discussion on the table about how we can perhaps encourage them to be more effective in working with each other and identifying the possibilities for collaboration for the greater good, period. But the firms don't think in that way. They're not mature enough. Even the largest ones among us don't think in that way. And so there is a void, if you will, that we need to address between understanding where we are and where we need to go in terms of clustering and how we make that effective leap for the region.
Just for clarification, what do you want them to do that they don't do exactly?
they don't see the potential in collaborating around an initiative. Invariably what happens is that we would provide a facilitator who would encourage them to even discuss their business with people that they're typically are competing with in the same room. They're not even of that orientation to consider, that there might be a public good or a greater good or something that they can all benefit from. They're very insular.
Can I give you an example? So you may have an industry where you have a number of small firms, one firm.
So, yeah, you have one firm that is able to penetrate and export markets. Yeah, and you have the other firms who can produce, but they're not able on their own to be able to penetrate that market. The notion, for example, of maybe giving up your brand and collectively and producing individually, but for a singular brand, so that you're now able to produce the volume in order to penetrate that market, is anathema to their thing. They will not even consider it. They prefer to simply remain where they are, doing what they're doing, but they will not consider it. They will not consider moving beyond that. And then if you ask the large firm, is probably doing it to share, lessons learned, and that's what happened. Make a side example, but
Can I add a sentence here that what we try to, in justifying this kind of interventions, we talk a lot about coordination failure. We talked about the idea that, and this is a long story in economics. Albert Hirschman and several others started talking about, José Stanfordin started talking about the idea that in an economy it often happens that firms would pursue their interest, it would be perfectly rational and informed, but at the same time, in the absence of a clear coordination with other actors, the optimal for the whole society, for the whole economy would not be achieved. And we often use the example of the tourism industry, whereby unless we plan together, building a road, and building a harbor, and building a hotel, and setting up an advertising strategy, and training the right kind of cook, and so on, we would have isolated hotels, or we would have roads with no hotels at the end, or we would have hotels with no personnel, and so on. And sometimes the role of an external actor can help facilitate this coordination.
Question I'd like to ask the Complete Caribbean lady. Was any work put into meeting with the persons who are involved in this cluster prior to the process to educate and inform them about what the benefits and opportunities are of getting into this type of framework?
That is a starting point for it. It's a very involved process, but that's often where we start, and that's why we can tell you, as I said before, unequivocally, that we have to start there. There's a learning that has to take place before we see any effective activity as a result of this clustering. So, and we're learning that for the region, for our firms, it takes a little while longer than we had anticipated, because there's a very intense trust issue that pervades and actually undermines to some extent what we're trying to do.
Okay, what were some of the main concerns that was presented during this evaluation process as to why they were so opposed to this type of collaboration?
It happens, it's different in every case, and it depends on the dynamics of the firms that you're working with.
And I just want, for my information, what were some of the concerns that were raised, given if you have any examples?
In terms of why they would not want to work with each other, it was mostly that they didn't understand the opportunities that were there or involved with working with each other. It was a learning issue for the most part.
On this issue, and I think the learning is a key. And then I just thought about one example of a proper DEIP, which is a sort of scheme that I think you know quite well, implemented by the Chilean government. I think they are actually, they are trying to create a trust and also create a sort of collaborative work, but then what they did was not to force them to, not force them to work together, but then, they offer the fund and they offer the expertise for those group of firms who come up with one problem that they want to solve. And through that, I think they would be able to come up, get together and solve that, and then they would be able to build a trust from there and then to go on to the other level of, I think, collaboration.
That's exactly how it works.
My take is that I wouldn't use the word educate firms, because in several instances firms know much more, certainly know much more than what I do, and most of us do not belong to a business environment, so we have our competencies and different skills and different set of information. So it's really a matter of helping them coordinate. They would, I'm sure, in several Caribbean islands, they would like, and I actually took part in a very amusing cluster development work in Tobago, where they wanted to create the clusters of small hotels, and they were missing cooks. So there was a cook from the Bahamas that came over to Tobago and trained the different cooks. And no small hotel alone would solve the problem of training and finding and paying for a good cook. But they put together the effort, and the European Union was providing some grant funding, and they carried out this training program, and that solved the problem. They were all facing, they would have liked to collaborate, but they didn't know how. And this helped them solve the problem. So it's really a matter of my mind of coordination.
Defining a common problem.
Defining a common problem.
I also think there's a role for public policy in this. I mean, it's a little bit difficult for Caribbean because of its structure, but certainly at a country level, it allows policymakers to find creative ways to direct policy to that kind of grouping as opposed to individual groups.
Yes.
Last question, lunch, when last one.
Yes. Just on the other side as well too, and you said not really using the word education, but for example, the example that you gave, let's say, and I don't know if people in Tobago know about it, but let's say maybe it would help if more persons who participated in the cluster initiative and were successful, if you could somehow engage and to demonstrate that success on a more interactive level with persons that you're trying to encourage to do that. So, for example, rather than it coming from the technician or the person who facilitates that, the persons who have participated in the process, gone through the experience, and so then engage them with the persons that, in a similar environment like this, persons who you would like to do the same thing too. Because what I've realized from the work that I do, nothing beats that level of experience and contact where a business person or a cluster of business persons to another business person can then say, listen, I've been through it. Because in their mind, the perception is you're not a business person. You don't know. You don't lose profits. You don't experience this. But a business person can talk on that level, and then they would appreciate the knowledge.
No, that's very true. Thank you for this comment. As a matter of fact, one of the specific instruments that these programs use is this visits to see what happened in other firms and other clusters around the world. And really learn from other pairs, from other businessmen and women who've been going through the same process. And then today we have innovation systems. How does it all fit together? Are we talking the same language, or are we adding new ideas and new systems and new jargon? Let me try to, in this hour, I'll try to give you an idea of how I see how these elements are related, and I will do it in in stages by first looking at what clusters are, then briefly looking at what value chains are, and then how these two concepts, these two dimensions are related, and how this is all related and embedded into innovation systems. This summarizes a huge amount of work and consulting and research and policy advice to governments. That's a cover of a book that we published together with some colleagues, trying to put together already these issues of clusters and value chains and linking them to the innovation systems, and arguing that these different strands of literature, these different approaches by themselves alone, they do not encompass the whole set of problems, the complementarities and the different policy issues that are underlying each of them, and we need to look at all of them at the same time, because these are really theories and ex post rationalization, but reality is much more complex than how we can manage to describe it and actually categorize in different taxonomies and concepts. And one focus of this lecture will really be the learning. Learning is one side of the innovation, in my mind. Learning at the firm level is very important. Innovation, we're not talking about frontier, you say blue sky or very advanced innovation, producing something that is new to the world, or doing it in a way that nobody has been using before. But innovation is really improving marginally. It's adding new dimensions. It is producing a slightly different product with a slightly different process, and incrementally adding something. Innovation can also be something that is new to the firm, not necessarily to the country or the world. And learning has an important function, plays an important function within the innovation process, as it enables innovation. It enables pushing the frontier, the firm level frontier forward, and improving organization and processes and products. So I'll look into this as well, and I think that the learning dimension is very important to understand a little bit all this. I guess that this morning's discussions already touched upon some of these issues, and wondering why we're now talking about value chains and clusters and innovation, and this is, in my mind, a reflection of the current changes in reality, in the global landscape, and how industry is organized worldwide, and how firms organize their activities that span different countries, and innovation plays a role in most of firms' activities. So what we observe is that production tends to be, at the same time, globally geographically dispersed, fragmented in a way, and functionally integrated. So this means that different steps of the production process, different components are made in different places. So in a way the production process is fragmented, but at the same time it's functionally integrated. So there's someone that is pulling the threads, that is leading the process, that has the rationality behind the organization of these production processes. And this is what we are observing more and more. And we see that their dispersion across countries grows. Large firms, as well as buyers, play a larger role worldwide. I used to look at the Fortune 500 list of countries a few years ago, and the names that most frequently appeared on top were Mobil, Exxon, Shell, the big oil companies, essentially, and then Ford and Toyota and the big manufacturing companies. If you go into the Fortune 500 nowadays, you won't find these companies anymore. The largest firm in the country, in the world, is now Walmart. And then among the largest are Apple computers and Google. And I don't know how big or how much to value Facebook, but totally different companies, including companies that do not manufacture much, but they buy a lot from other countries and from other companies, and organize production, and organize distribution, and sell them, and organize retail chains, and supply supermarkets, and supply intermediate producers. So the network of production relationships is getting more and more complex, and this reflects the emergence of what are usually called global value chains, global supply chains, or production chains, or production networks, or a number of different modes of organizing production and international transactions. Well, while we observe that reality is changing in this fashion, at the same time we realize that clusters, that firms keep being agglomerated. If you look for salt production, you would probably go to 2 or 3 different places in the world. My own country, in the northern part, in Como, and then you would go to other parts in China, and a few other places. And if you want to go and see where computers are made, you probably go to some parts in China and somewhere else in the States for some minor components. And so there's still a phenomenon of geographical agglomeration of production that is persisting, in spite of this globalization of production, in spite of the big Walmarts buying intermediate products and services from all over the world. So this, in reality, even if economists and business specialists proposed ideas and concepts such as clusters, and then value chains, and then observing foreign direct investment, and so on, all these phenomena occur at once, and they are interrelated, and they all overlap. And perhaps the unifying concept that is behind all this, in my mind, is really the linkages dimension. The transactions and the linkages among the different actors. It can be at the local level, it can be international, it can involve the public sectors as well as the private sector, as well as knowledge producers and universities and research centers, and the different government agencies promoting enterprise development and innovation development, and so on. So it's there's a growing network of linkages among many different actors that is behind the economic growth and behind the development of countries and their economies. And the governance of this relationship, the coordination, and how coordination serves the purpose of promoting development in different places is key, is crucial. So the reality is getting complex and complex. Let me try to focus on what I think within this context, within this world that is changing in a way whereby geographical agglomeration of production coexists with the organization of production along value chains and production chains, and the role of services in this world that is growing. I think that the key concept that explains how firms can take advantage of these different forms of industrial organization is through upgrading. Upgrading as a necessary condition for, in the literature there's this discussion about the high road or the low road to globalization and international competitiveness, whereby, I mean, one way of being competitive worldwide, that is something I was listening to a couple of weeks ago in Mexico, where we are working with the IDB, with the government there, and one of the discussions we often hear is that the Mexican economy is getting more and more competitive. Then you ask them, why is it getting more competitive? And the answer is that wages are growing faster in China, our wages are not growing, and therefore we are more competitive. Is this a good business? I don't think it is. I think that the real challenge is to grow, to improve productivity and competitiveness, as well as wages. So the key behind the a useful and productive insertion into international markets and competitiveness is really adding innovation, introducing innovation to production processes, to services, to service provision, and adding value through the innovation process. And different scholars have been trying to classify what upgrading is, what it means. I mean, upgrading is often a very, very generic term. So upgrading means, I mean, to our ears, it often means just improvements. And I don't want you bring home the feeling that upgrading is a very generic term. I mean, in our terminology, upgrading is something very specific. It means applying innovation to production and service provision, and with the aim of adding value. And upgrading can take different forms. This is one possible categorization. When we talk of upgrading of processes, of products, of functions, and intersectoral upgrading. Let me explain you very briefly what it is. It is easy to explain this looking at a value chain. The value chain, in its most simple, in its simplest form, is a sequence of different activities. Suppose that you're producing a wooden furniture, a wooden table, then you would have to produce the wooden logs. Then you would have to work them and transform them into furniture pieces, and then have the final product and sell it. This can be done by one firm, by many different firms. And these different firms can be located in different countries. I mean, in my little garden in Rome, I used to have a very nice wooden table. And there was a label saying that the wood was coming from Vietnam, it had been assembled in South Africa, and it was sold in the streets of Rome for $50. So if one really wonders where value is added, considering transportation and considering all the work and the services and so on. But the different functions can be carried out by one firm or several firms. Suppose that A, B, and C are different firms. Product and process upgrading is something that takes place within a firm, within a production segment, the production stage, whereby a firm improves its products or improves its production process and improves productivity and carries out a process, some process upgrading. Or suppose that the firm, instead of just producing the wooden logs, learns how to produce the whole furniture, the whole table. So having additional machines, having additional skills, and the skilled personnel required to do that. And instead of just selling the wooden logs, it would sell the finished furniture. It would probably get access to a larger share of the value that is being produced. This is something I would call functional upgrading, getting into different business functions, different production functions, and adding to manufacturing capacity, also design capacity, for example, learning how not just to assemble and manufacture, but design different components and different products. Or even using the skills learned by working in one chain and using it into a different chain, or to enter a different chain. I have a few examples here. For example, product upgrading. When firms move into more sophisticated goods, products, they start selling goods that sell at a higher price. And this is often related to different distribution channels. In Asia, for example, the apparel commodity chain initially started selling into discount chains and then department stores, where department stores sell at a higher price. So they were gradually upgrading their products and getting access to shops where they could sell at a higher price. Or examples of process upgrading, like what food producers have been experiencing in southern Brazil for many years, where thanks to the collaboration with the North American buyers, they managed to improve the production process. They managed to add new machines and improve the layout and better use the skills and the technical and engineering skills required to produce shoes. So really adding and improving productivity. Or functional upgrading, when firms acquire new functions or abandon existing ones so that they can increase the overall skill content of their activities. There's an example that was made famous by Gary Gareffi and Jennifer Baird of Torreon in Mexico, in northern Mexico. Torreon in Mexico is known as the capital of the blue jeans, where companies like Wrangler and Levi's and Gap and several others operate. And Mexican producers gradually learned how to enter into different functions. Instead of just assembling the different pieces of cloth, they learned how to put them together and sell them as a package to different department stores in the US. So appropriating part of the value that was being created elsewhere. If we have time, I have more details on this and we can see it later. And perhaps some of you already listened to this story, having listened to Gary Gareffi and his group in the past few months. And intersectional upgrading is another way of looking at the process of upgrading, whereby firms, by developing the competencies while operating in a value chain, they use the same competencies and venture into a different chain. In Taiwan in the 90s was the largest producer of TV sets, and within that decade it became the largest world producer of PC screens. Technologies are related, they're relatively near, and by developing the competencies to become very good TV set producers, they venture into the more profitable business of screen computers. And this is what they did over a short period of time, with an intensive process of learning and innovation behind this. This is a big question. I mean, if upgrading is necessary, upgrading is the relevant concept and is required to strengthen industrial development and growth. How can small firms, local firms, I mean, this is not only related to small firms, it's really related to all local firms, all developing countries firms, all Caribbean firms that want to. Yesterday I was trying to catch a flight that took me here very late last night, and there was an HSBC advertisement with a little table and different lemonades. I don't know whether you've seen it. And this ad was saying, also for lemonade, there's always a global market. There was a little boy squeezing lemons, and there's a new ad by this bank that is showing how global markets matter and how firms need to face themselves with global markets and learn how to compete in these global markets. And in my mind, two different ways of organizing production and organizing linkages with other firms and other institutions and get access to these upgrading processes is by working in clusters and in value chains. So clusters and value chains, in a way, from point of view of the developing countries, firms are instrumental to carry out processes of upgrading. And clusters in value chain among the academics among you belong to, or were initially started from two different strands of literature. One that was looking at the role of local linkages in generating competitive advantages in export industries. So there was this phenomenon of Italian and German sets of small enterprises all agglomerating next to each other and linked to each other and generating competitive advantages in spite of their small size. And then the phenomenon expanded and looking through cluster lenses, we discovered that clusters exist all over the world and there are different degrees of agglomeration. But a literature was generated by the observation of this specific phenomenon of agglomeration of production activities. And the global value chain literature started from a very different standpoint. Started at looking how multinational companies organize their activities. And it started realizing that multinational companies set up different subsidiaries and different linkages with different countries, so their activities tend to be fragmented worldwide. So the standpoint is very different. From the standpoint of a CEO of a large corporation organizing its companies, his companies or her companies' activities worldwide, whereas the clusters tend to look at the phenomenon of agglomeration from a local standpoint. Yet, they will come to closer to similar concepts. If I were to give a definition of clusters, I would recall two people. Peccattini, I don't know whether you've heard of him. This is an Italian economist from Florence, who was the president of the Italian Economists Association, who's been writing, following the steps of Alfred Marshall in England, was focusing very much on the idea of industrial districts. And he emphasized this idea of thickening of society and thickening of production systems, whereby firms and society tends to overlap and each influences the other, and agglomeration brings about advantages to local firms. And the work of Michael Porter, that is probably more famous than Peccattini, has been popularizing the concept of clusters, focusing on the idea that they are a geographic concentration of competing and cooperating companies, suppliers, service providers, and other institutions. And the mystery behind both definitions is that there's both a process of competition and a process of collaboration. And wherever I go and talk about the Italian industrial clusters, people will tell me, well, you're Italian, Italians love each other, Italians have a good character, everybody loves them, and for them it's easy to collaborate. But here we don't collaborate. Barbados, collaborate? You ever collaborate? Do you like your neighbors? You like the other firms you're competing with? You're competing. You're not collaborating. I'm arguing that this is not true. That all firms try to maximize or get the most they can from their markets, and they only collaborate if it's convenient to them. But there's several instances where it is convenient to them to collaborate, and we'll see why. So it's not a matter of culture, a matter of being different. So the others collaborate because they're Europeans, but it's not. This is not the case. And the key story is that, as other colleagues like Huber Schmitz from Sussex and others called this phenomenon, firms localizing clusters benefit from collective efficiency. It's a nice word. It's efficiency, but it's collective. So it's not efficiency to the disadvantage of the others. On the other hand, belonging to the same cluster helps strengthening your efficiency, improving your productive conditions. And firms, what's the key behind that? Behind the success of these clusters? There's two key dimensions. One is that firms' agglomeration generate external economies. That is something that firms do not necessarily look for, but they're there. If they are agglomerated there, they can benefit from a number of externalities. And this is also the reason why public policies are justified, because externalities tend to limit the functioning of markets, tend to introduce market failures, and call for policy interventions. But at the same time, firms' agglomeration opens the way to what the literature calls joint actions or collaborative actions on trying to do something together to our common benefits. Let us create brand. Let us create. We all face the problem of working with leather and processing leather, but we don't have the minimum size required to have a laboratory and explore how different colors can be used of different kinds of leather. Unless we put resources together, we'll never be able to do it. And if we do that, we will all benefit. But none of them would do it alone. Being agglomerated, you may have more opportunities to generate these collective actions. So there's a set of spontaneous advantages and a set of collective joint actions that can be developed, and this brings about collective efficiency. When we talk about externalities or external economies, what do I have in mind? Those of you who study more economics are probably familiar with these ideas, with these concepts, like if you have different firms localized in the same place, this would itself probably generate a pool of specialized skills. I mean, if you had studied, engineering for some specific microchip products that are used for advanced electronics, where would you go? You would go where the largest firms in the world producing and assembling electronics are located. Probably China, perhaps the western coast of the United States. And this creates pools of specialized skills where firms, if they wanted an engineer with this kind of features, would probably go to Silicon Valley or Taiwan or a few other places in the world. And this is an advantage. So firms would find the appropriate kind of skills close to where they are, or close to where these clusters are. The same often applies to the supply of specialized inputs. There's an idea of the information and the knowledge that is relevant to a production that is easily diffused within clusters. Of course, there's always this trade-off between releasing information and knowledge and trying to keep control of innovation and preventing it from spilling over to others. But to some extent, the secrets of the trade tend to be widespread and tend to circulate more intensively where firms agglomerate rather than in other places. Improve market access, concentration attracts customers. So if a big customer wants to buy a specific product, would probably go where several firms produce the same thing. So that's another advantage that is spontaneous. It does not require any explicit effort to collaborate, but it's something that agglomeration brings about. And in some cases, there's this phenomenon called social capital. In the literature, there are many different definitions, but it's something, this intangible trust and collaboration and confidence in what we do here with other firms that are neighboring and with whom we've been sharing markets and activities. This would provide additional advantages. And the joint action I was talking about are different forms. There are different taxonomies of joint actions. These are examples that come from different projects carried out by the DEIP. Sorry, this is Spanish, but these are examples that, for example, have to do with buying intermediate inputs together. A group of firms that decides to go and buy and bargain better terms as the order size is larger, or reducing the cost of trading abroad and organizing missions and visits to potential customers or trade fairs, or defining a norm or a standard. This is an example of grape producers in Colombia, where they needed, and they got some support from the DEIP to build a brand, to set a number of standards that defined what uva Isabella, what Isabella grape is, and what qualifies to be Isabella grape, and now Isabella grape commands higher prices in the market. That was the result of a joint, consciously pursued action, and so on. Examples of this sort. Let me spend a couple of minutes on this issue of clusters definition and clusters mapping. I know that some of you have gone through a process of cluster mapping and exercise to map where clusters are and what they are. In general, clusters need to have a critical mass of firms that tend to be specially concentrated with some degree of sectoral specialization. The even bigger question, how do innovation systems affect these learning processes that may occur within value chains? It's very hard to summarize this in a few minutes, but let me try to jump to the taxonomy I was describing before. This is the same taxonomy I was showing you with those diagrams, with those big arrows and different structures of the value chain, is repeated here. And the others were explaining that the governance type, the market modular relational captive or hierarchical model, tend to depend on these three different variables: the complexity of transactions, the codification of transactions, and the competence of suppliers. How good suppliers are, whether the transaction can be codified, so I can send you a recipe and you produce the screw that is described according to those internationally agreed standards or standards set by the company, or the complexity of transactions, that is, when it's very hard to carry out the transaction, where you cannot simply rely on the market, go to the market and buy whatever screw that the market would require. If you need a screw for an iPhone, you cannot buy any screw from whatever supplier. You need to have that specific one that responds to those specific standards. So this has an impact on the likelihood of the emergence of the different forms of value chain. What do the IS, the innovation systems, have to do with all this? They have to do, I think, a lot. There's still a lot of, this is still work in progress, and there's not much evidence on helping us to understand a little bit how innovation systems affect learning in value chains. But in a well-functioning innovation system, the costs of transactions are low, the relational forms of governance are more likely, so that the big firms do not have to do everything themselves. They can rely on the market to a larger extent. It's easier and less costly to carry out transactions in the market. And And this, for example, was very effective in Taiwan, where the first value chains that were developed in the country tended to be more hierarchical. Large buyers and producers, mainly from the United States and Japan, that invested there. They tended to have very, very rigid structures and organization. And gradually, the process of developing capabilities in local firms helped these firms, and the innovation system prevailing in the country helped these firms to move from a hierarchical to a more relational value chain that allowed some extent of functional upgrading by local producers. And what we found out is that the presence of active technical bodies and technical institutions and organizations and laboratories and public research institutions and so on, they help a lot in this process. They help to bridge and coordinate chain leaders and their local partners. They ease the exchange of complementary knowledge. They reduce the complexity of transactions. So they actually helped make the value chains less hierarchical, more relational, and creating more room for functional upgrading by local firms. The issue of codification of transactions is another major issue, and that has to do with all the organizations in charge of standards and metrology in an innovation system. Provided that these organizations are in place and they work effectively, it's more likely that modular chains and relational chains will prevail. And I'm quoting here the work that Michigo has been doing on salmon, where the organizations, and specifically the Association of Salmon Industries in southern Chile, played a role helping the involvement of local firms, both as value chain leaders and qualified suppliers in foreign-led chains. And of course, I mean, there's a word of caution here, because the salmon industry in Chile developed in a way that neglected the impact on the environment, and it suffered a major crisis 2-3 years ago. And this crisis reminds us of the need for very, very tight regulations encompassing environmental standards and issues. And of course, the stronger the supplier's competencies are, the easier it is to have a relational value chain, and easier it is to have firms upgrading functionally and getting into more sophisticated segments of value chain, and therefore, working with and strengthening the technological capabilities of local firms would help these firms gain and get better benefits from interacting with global value chains. And then there's this issue of intersectoral upgrading, learning across different value chains and acquiring competences, and then investing in using these competences to enter into different value chains. And these are some examples that prove to be effective in helping this learning. Let me try, just one slide here to make a quick conclusion. This literature is emphasizing a lot the role of governance patterns in influencing the potential for upgrading that is open to local firms. Governance patterns tend to be dynamic and do change over time. They're subject to changes. So we need to adopt a dynamic look when we look at value chains and explore and study their governance and study how these chains can actually influence local firms' upgrading. The characteristics of the innovation system affect this evolution and therefore have an impact on learning opportunities. I mean, it's a two-way relationship. Innovation systems help local firms getting and exploiting the potential advantages offered by global value chains, and in turn, global value chains may influence the innovation system and may help strengthen the innovation system in some cases or hinder the development of the innovation system in other ways. But it's a dual, multi-causal relationship. Of course, I mean, these are all very complex issues. There's issue of data availability. It's very hard to go beyond case studies that are very specific to specific examples, and we're all trying to build more data to analyze these issues and look at what policy instruments can be implemented in